Hi everyone, this is a tutorial and a sort of archival exploration of a really old project, probably one of the first projects I sort of made when I shifted over to TouchDesigner, that found its way into a performance I did in about 2022, I think. In this performance, I was using a slit scan technique, which is one of the first things I learned how to do in TouchDesigner that I found super exciting. I loved sort of slit scan effects. And I started incorporating this to a particle system, so I kind of called this a particle slit scan effect. I don't actually have that original file, or I can't find it, so this has also been an exploration for me in recreating that file, which has been really kind of, it's been quite fun. I also have found a few other kind of things from that era that use a similar technique, using this particle system to manipulate a video input of me, and also something that's using a chroma version and optical flow to basically kind of do data mush effects on videos. But all these effects are essentially using the same underlying mechanism. And so recreating it has been kind of fun to do as a challenge. So it's actually a pretty simple network. I'm going to keep all this stuff on the screen, but I'm going to mute it and we're going to start from scratch. I might have forgotten some stuff, so I might refer back to it, and yeah, hope you like this one. Okay, so I've muted that network. Before I start, I'm going to split my screen with Alt left square bracket, and I'm going to do Alt 4, so it's going to be in top viewer. So this means that if I want to view a top, it's going to appear in my right hand slice of the screen and not in my background. What I've done to make sure I don't see it in the background is I've right clicked, I've gone to display, and I have turned off backdrop tops, and this toggles on if we have a background or not. And I find this a much easier space to work in. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a rectangle SOP. And this is going to be the space where I instance all of my particles. Now, if we just take a look at that rectangle in the viewer, I'm going to turn on my display options and look at all these points. We can see that we only have 1, 2, 3, 4 points, or 0, 1, 2, 3. And basically what we want is to create lots of points that we can use within that rectangle space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create something called a sprinkle. And what a sprinkle allows me to do is basically create a lot of points within a geometrical space, for example, like that rectangle that I've set out. If I go into my parameters, I can define whether it's going to be per surface, per primitive in a bounding box, approximate volume, or volume. Surface is just fine for this. It's just going to sprinkle points randomly all over the surface of my rectangle. And I can also define how many points I want. So right now by default it's set to 1,000, and I just want it to be 100. So we can see we have a lot fewer points now. The second thing I'm going to do before bringing this into my particle SOP is I'm going to drag out and I'm going to create a sort. And what the sort's going to allow me to do is run through these particles in a certain order. So I could go by vertex order, X, Y, Z axes, or reverse, but I just want to go in a random sequence. And we'll see how this works when we plug this into our particle SOP. Now at the start, we're not going to see that much change because our birth rate is the same, but let's move our birth rate down a little bit. And let's also add in some kind of forces so we can see that movement. So let's add in a turbulence force of 1 onto the X, Y, Z. And we're going to turn up that turbulent period to 1.5. And so we can see that every now and then particles are getting instanced in that section. If I turned up my birth rate back up to 100, we could see that it is now a greater number of particles. If I shifted, say, to generate by X, we should see that things are kind of going across the screen. So if I increased my sprinkle to say 1,000 and my particle mass to 100, we can see there's a sort of a line going across the screen that's drawing these out. And we want something that's actually going to be random, so we don't want things to be in a specific order. So we're selecting random on that sort SOP. In terms of the particle, I'm going to make a few tweaks. I'm going to turn the turbulence period down to 1.07, and let's see what happens if we also expand the size of this to 3. Okay, great. You can see here we have particle movement moving across the scope of that rectangle in a much nicer and sort of more unified way, whilst also having its own sort of turbulent characteristics. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create another rectangle SOP. We're going to plug it into a transform, and I'm going to set the uniform scale to 0.5. I'm going to bring this out into a geo, and I'm going to the instancing tab. I'm going to turn instancing on, and I'm going to use the particles as my translate operator. So I'm going to use the 0.0 position, the 0.1 position, and we could use the Z position as well if you wanted, but you don't have to if you just want it to be in 2D. We can see as we scan around, it just elevates that height a little bit, but the way we'll be viewing it, it's going to be more or less the same. We can also see these particles are kind of chunky right now. You could play with that transform, but what we're going to do instead is use the transform V0 parameter for our positions. And so now you can see that these are scaled in different sizes, and you don't have to use it in that Z parameter. If you do, obviously you get this effect where things are kind of shaded differently. So for the purposes of what we're doing with this slit scan effect, it's better to just keep it on the X and the Y parameter. Okay, so now let's render this. I'm going to create a render top. We're going to go in and create a camera. And all we need to really do here is also just bring in a constant top. You could use something more fancy later down the line if you wanted specific textures, but we really just want a white square that moves around. So we now have these square points moving around, and this is going to be the start of our network where we manipulate these particles with color and use a feedback loop and some other effects to make these interesting point trails. I'm going to press the X key just to visualize those connections. I must have accidentally pressed it whilst I was working, and basically the X key toggles on and off these linked connections. To start blending this with a video, I'm going to bring something in, and I actually was able to find the video I was using for that original effect back in 2022. And it's sort of like an AI GAN generated thing, and I really like the colors and the flow. I'm going to add in a transform, and I'm going to scale it to fill my frame. If you're using something that isn't already in a 1280 by 720 format, in this case it is, but it has a lot of black on the sides that will not be picked up when we multiply. You can use a fit if it's a smaller frame size. But in this case, I'm just expanding that to fill the frame so we get those color manipulations. You can obviously use any input. In this case, it is a little bit fast, so I'm going to turn down the speed to 0.5. And we can see that makes it become a little bit jerky. Even if we turn it down lower, you'll get that example better. So if we go over to image, and interpolate frames, we can see that tries to smooth out those frame interpolations and create something that is less jittery between those frames. You can see it's a really big difference in how smooth that is. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just show you what these look like multiplied together. I'm also going to add a null, which will be eventually the end of my chain. So this is looking kind of interesting. And we now have these particles multiplying with the underlying color. Essentially what we're seeing is a masked image here that we're able to reveal with these particles. This is great, and now we can start actually working on our feedback loop. We're going to bring this down here as a chain that we can use later. I'm just also going to disconnect that for now. I'm going to bring in my transform into a feedback. I'm going to plug that into a displace, and I'm going to bring in my original image as well to act as that displacement grid, and let's just see what that looks like at the moment. Right now we haven't attached anything to that feedback, so it's a single frame and we are displacing. I'm going to turn down my displace weight to 0.001 on both axes, so a very small amount. I'm also then going to plug this into a blur, and this is something we'll sort of toggle on and off later as we are manipulating this network, basically to control that mixing between the two layers that we're going to work with. I'm going to plug in a lens distort, which is sort of an extra feature that we can use for some interesting feedback patterns. And finally, I'm going to plug this into a comp, and the comp is going to be set to over, and this is essentially where we recombine these elements. I'm going to basically layer this over the feeding back system. So I'm going to drop this into my feedback, and we can see we have this distortion field. On the blur, I'm going to turn it up to a pre-shrink of 2 and a filter size of 6. Obviously you can play with this as much as you want. Before I connect everything together, I'm going to add in a keyboard in, press A to make the viewer active, and drag that into my pulse reset, so now I can reset whenever I want. And I'm going to drag my multiplication here, which has the masked sections of that image, or the revealed sections of that image, into my component. Obviously, because it's set to over, the top layer is still what we're seeing, so I'm going to swap my operation order, and now we should get that sort of effect we were seeing before. I'm going to turn down a few things in my blur to make that background more accessible. And obviously this is something you can play with as you go as well. There we go, that's a lot better. Now we've reset that system. So you can play with how much blur you have in the system to make it more or less sort of ethereal and dreamy. And this is feeling pretty good right now. I'm kind of liking this. I'm going to add in a larger number of particles being birthed. I think I'm going to go up to 100. So that's going to make the system a bit more sort of active. I can also zoom in with my camera to create different sections of that effect. I can zoom really out and have everything sort of nested in the center, or I can zoom way in and have a lot more activity happening all over the screen. I can also do things like I can amp up my particle turbulence, and we can see here that sort of makes things move more in sync with each other and have more of a sort of a fluid motion. And I'm also going to go in and just manipulate this sprinkle as well, so we have more points to choose from to be birthed into our system. So we've got 1,000 points now to sort of be birthed in. You could play around with things like the life expectancy. You could have it super short. or you can have it super long, and then more things will get added in and sort of overlay on each other. In that case, you might want to bring some things down, like the particle births, or things like the transform uniform scale. Let's try making that like 0.25, or even just like 0.35 in this case. And it starts looking really painterly and making some sort of interesting effects. The final thing I want to show you here is this lens distort. So lens distort basically allows us to create a lens distortion effect. So obviously we get these sort of curves that we can create, fisheye lens essentially. Or we can move things to a different sort of left-right axis and control more aggressively the direction of feedback. I'm going to go ahead and just reset this, reset parameters. Something that I kind of like to do is have this a little bit controlled with something like a noise or a kind of a kick, in the case that I'm doing something audio reactive. So at certain points I can control it to kind of come into this static center and then move out. I'm also going to add a RGB key for these kind of situations where my background is visible, so I can see a black background or a matte background versus a transparent one. And something we can also do is we can flip this distortion on and off, and changing things like the focal lengths and the optical center. So let's just try adding in something as a fun little experiment. I'm going to create a noise. I'm going to turn the time slice on, and I'm going to create a X and Y channel, and I'm going to plug this into my optical centers. We can see things are sort of moving around and crushing in on themselves. If I reset that to 0, we're just playing with the optical center around how much distortion this is. So if I turn this down to a lower value, like 0.01, then that scale of movement will be less. I'm also going to turn up my amplitude amount and my period, so that we get these things moving a bit more slowly. So bring that down now. And so this is something you could play with to have some kind of causality. If there's some kind of action that you do, or if there's an audio cue, you could make this sort of do something. But it's also quite nice to have just to add in a little bit of change to that system over time. I'm just going to turn it down a lot just so that the change is a lot less drastic. Even small tweaks to this can be kind of really nice and can mix up the vibe of your system a little bit. Finally, something that's really nice to do is just to turn up that uniform scale really large, so the majority of what you're seeing is actually that combined image being overlaid over that feedback, and you get something that feels sort of really wishy and dreamy. As I kind of showed you earlier, some other effects you could play with are going to involve using your camera in real time and using the system to kind of manipulate that. I think in one of these examples that I found from the archives, I'm using a metaball, maybe in this one. So my optical flow and various other things are controlling feedback, but also I have metaballs that are pulling particles in. I'm thinking of it more like a particle system that I can control the particles using 3D objects. So this can be fun ways of kind of applying those techniques that you would often use in particle systems to the underlying particles that are controlling things here. Or you could play around with things like the forces. So if you put in a force of wind, you could make things go in a specific direction. Let's do -1 and make it go down. So you could really kind of play with things to have more like a waterfall effect, or you could add in external forces like metaballs and things like that to create more to create more radical changes in the system. So I hope you like this, and stay tuned for more tutorials. I'm going to post this completed file, but also the files of this and this in my Patreon if you want to play with them. I'm going to take a bit of time to clean these up because these two files I just showed you are really old. They're probably from 2022.